One of the things you'll notice about support channels for trauma recovery is their disclaimers about not being clinicians. And of course, that matters. If you don't have credentials to give medical advice, it's probably a good idea to let that be known. In a similar respect, it's necessary to get a one-on-one consultation anyway, for your own good, which doesn't always come easy. Most employers have referrals to free therapy resources, but you're only allowed so many sessions. And therapists have schedules that don't always mesh with your own. I mean, I'm not living on a budget right now, but for those who do and have to take time off from work, well, then it's no longer a free service if you catch my drift. Then comes the project of finding the right therapist, assuming there even is such a thing. Let's get one thing straight here. Therapists run a business in which they sell a product for profit that happens to be their therapy. They might like what they do and have an established bond with the people they see. They might even work around your hardships and obstacles. By the end of the day, however, it's still about the Benjamins. One of the most relevant factors to consider is that the majority of counselors are by the books and don't really think outside the box. Depression, anxiety, psychosis, drug addiction, household vocabulary, no question. Terms like gaslighting, covert incest, hoovering, and flying monkeys are more likely to draw a blank face. They probably won't do their own research, and if you tell them that you're going no contact with someone, they might interpret that as an unresolved grudge. The fact you're doing this to protect yourself is irrelevant unless they themselves have dealt with the toxic manipulator. Indeed, many counselors did enter their professions because they had their own traumatic experiences, but that doesn't mean they'll empathize with or even comprehend what you went through. Some of you might recall a video I did 2 years back on my channel called Memoirs of a Feminist Upbringing, which I told about the household matriarch who basically worked my father to death and threatened me with adoption and abandonment throughout my childhood years. Well, that was only a small fraction of the story. I didn't mention that she was also an alcoholic pill popper who strayed from the marriage and constantly relied on her children for emotional support. When I turned 18, she decided to cripple me financially of almost everything I had, not out of spite, but so that I was under her control. The mistake that she made was she also didn't want to have the responsibility that comes along with that. Basically, someone wanting to have their cake and eat it too. This left a loophole for me to break free, and when I cut off communication, I got my first-hand experience of what someone with a narcissistic injury does when they're given the middle finger. It wasn't pretty. Clearly, there was something radically wrong with this person, but alas, I was stuck in the fog, and when I matured as an adult and got into my first relationships, I was still stuck in the fog, or in layman's terms, the codependency trap. I'm no longer angry about that whole ordeal. I no longer feel mortified by the exploitation. I've since acknowledged that the people I once knew were not the individuals I thought they were. But I don't want a pity party, as I'm well beyond that particular stage. Just a full night's sleep again and a better sense of identity. That's all I ask, and it's been a work in progress for many years. As I said earlier, if you've seen your share of quacks, you've probably heard something along the lines of, oh, you just haven't overcome your anger. If I was told this 15 years ago, then that would make perfect sense. Now it comes across either as a cop-out or someone doing business by the books. I mean, it's like going to the doctor, telling them you're not feeling well, and they prescribe you a bottle of amoxicillin. What good is that going to do if you don't have a bacterial infection? Nothing, obviously. In fact, it might even do you a lot of harm. Well, the same rule applies to a therapist who interprets trauma as rage. They're either projecting their own feelings or trying to belittle you. Either way, not helping you. So where do you go when every therapist is waist deep in the same patronizing, unsympathetic, psychobabble nonsense? Well, if you get the service through an EAP, I say keep attending, just so long as you find someone who listens to what you have to say and offers some good advice. You want my best opinion? Make sure they have background knowledge of personality disorders. If not, it's probably not going to be worth it. You might get someone who's going to make up for that inexperience by toying you in order to keep you as their client. Don't let these people mess with your emotions. Remember, the appointments are all about you. And I'll expand on why that's so important towards the end of this video. Now, CPTSD. Take the C away from that, and you think of a tattered war veteran. That's only for a male sufferer. I suppose one could label that a complex form of post-traumatic stress disorder, but that's not how the term is applied. It's a little more complex. If I were to summarize it, you basically feel like a complete screw-up at life, even though everything else seems to prove the contrary. You go to school and have a job, you have a place to live, your finances are in okay shape, you can plan ahead, and yet there's this unspoken inadequacy that no one really sees because they never met the person who made you feel that way. Yeah, that would be a great way to put it, except inadequate is kind of nebulous. More appropriate terminology might be damaged goods, defunct currency, on the edge. And once again, this might not compute for the therapist. They might notice that you live life through neurotic and routine defense mechanisms, but they won't know the catalyst. The sole group of individuals most likely to believe and understand you are online communities of people who dealt with similar experiences. And although you'll find yourself related to many of their stories, that's not going to be the yellow brick road to recovery. Ultimately, it's going to take three things, which are actually quite basic. I call it the SET principles, or SET: self, experience, and time. First, realizing who you are, your triumphs, your faults, and what led to your past and current self. Knowing that there's a middle ground, unlike the split world you probably came from, you're neither perfect or flawed. But for the road you took, you're much closer to perfection. Next, gaining experience. I didn't acknowledge this until recently, but I basically spent the first years of my life as a feral child, or at least very close to one. Anytime I made friends at school, I was abruptly separated from them. Anytime we had company over, I was confined to my near-empty room. And a lot of verbal and motor skills weren't picked up until I was much older. I was raised to believe that a lot of this was my own doing, and the more I distanced myself from the originated environment, well, the more clarity was attained. The more the world seemed less hostile and more hospitable. Finally, there's the essence of time. Coming to grips is not going to be an easy 24-hour process. Those of us in the manosphere are aware of the red pill versus blue pill analogy, which is actually kind of an incomplete idea because there's so many layers to the socio-political crux. When it comes to taking pills to treat an illness, for example, medicine isn't the only regimen. You also have the importance of rest, drinking fluids, and patience. Speaking again for the red pill, if you accept the same idea over and over again without letting other things run their course, you will find yourself with a placebo effect in the psychological sense. And placebos aren't exactly inducive to the healing process. They say that the therapist's worst enemy is the client who's way too adept about their own ego and the human nature as a whole. And that's because there's nothing for them to work with. Someone struggling with an addiction, a crisis of faith, or morality is going to be easier to maneuver. They're in such a vulnerable state, which makes the relevance of mainstream therapy rather questionable for other people. In my case, I've probably known that for quite a while, longer than I'd like to admit. Back into the earlier, I guess maybe early to mid 90s, I was sent to a psychotherapist by the household matriarch for social problems at school. The therapist wasn't aware of what was really going on in classes or at home, and anything I told him was relayed back to her. There was no confidentiality. I had to be very careful about what was said because I didn't want any reprisal, and as a result, the real issues were never addressed. Then, I guess in a stroke of fate and chance, he saw through the lies that he was initially told. As I was waiting for one of his appointments in the clinic waiting room, I happened across a female classmate from school who was there for a different reason. We weren't friends per se, but we occasionally talked to each other about superficial topics. The therapist walked in on our conversation right before I was to be called in and immediately looked perplexed. The original idea was that I was completely incapable of socializing with other peers, couldn't even make eye contact. I refuted this little premise, and up until that point, my version of events didn't matter. So what's going on now? Although he didn't concede to his deception, he was certainly curious as to why I didn't turn socializing into sturdy friendships. You know, a group of kids I invited over to the house as opposed to one or two. And that was the second problem. When the matriarch got word about that classmate I ran into at the clinic, her reaction was akin to a schoolyard bully of elementary school level.
Ooh, Bachelor has a girlfriend. Ooh, Bachelor and a girl sitting in a tree. Kissing. Ooh.
She grilled me for quite a while about who this girl was. Shortly afterwards, I was no longer visiting the same therapist, and I wouldn't see another for 10 years, for a different reason and on my own will. At that juncture, I had gone through a tragic loss in the family, a messy breakup, and was facing burnout issues at work. In those days, I didn't know what an EAP was, so I paid for the visits out of pocket. I suppose one could call this both a loss and an empirical learning experience for all the wrong reasons. In terms of what I said about therapists at the beginning of this vlog, I think this next story will back up quite a bit. We'll call this lady Madeline. Every time I opened up about what was going on in my life, I was cut off with buzzwords and jargon that clearly came from a third-party source. I don't think one needs a degree in social work to memorize philosophy quotes. When it came to the loss of my family, Madeline tried to compare the grief to her stresses of being twice divorced. Curiously, she didn't make the same reference when I discussed the relationship I had with my ex. Almost entirely by default, I was made out as this villainous ex-boyfriend, embittered with rage, inflexible to forgive, forget, and move on, saturated in misogyny. It only required 2 visits to realize that her therapy was worthless, and I was wasting my time with someone who was cold and unengaged with her clients' concerns. Her inept use of the M word was suggestive of everyone's favorite gender cult. After all, no other group is more vigorous about a career in social work. You really got to hand it to the persons who coined inmates running the asylum or wolves in sheep's clothing. So when it comes to mainstream therapy and reeling from the aftershock of past hardships, caveat emptor. Just like any other kind of service, you're going to have a lot of dodgy merchants, and as far as the genuine wares go, one size doesn't fit all. So if you have things to get off your chest, the question shouldn't be so much about whether you should see someone, but are you all set?